On this edition of Crime Chronicles, I come to you from Robert Clement Park in Littleton, Colorado. To my right, over this hill, is Columbine High School, where on April 20th, 1999, two students at Columbine carried out the worst school massacre in U.S. history. On this edition, we take a look at the Columbine Massacre. Of all the crimes that I've looked at over my career, perhaps none is more vexing, more perplexing, and even more tragic than the Columbine Massacre. What would drive two well-to-do teenage boys, 17-year-old Dylan Klebold, 18-year-old Eric Harris, with no serious criminal record, although there were troubling signs in their behavior in the year leading up to this, what would cause these two boys to go to their school, try to kill as many people as possible, kill 11 fellow students, one teacher, wound many others, some very seriously, and then turn the guns on themselves? Eric Harris was 18 years old at the time this occurred in 1999. He was raised in a military family, and he was described by people as someone who became increasingly angry and hateful toward the entire human race as his teenage years progressed. For Eric Harris, the Columbine Massacre was a long-held dream of simply killing as many people as he could.
Eric David Harris was born on April 9, 1981 in Wichita, Kansas. His father was an Air Force transport pilot and his mother was a homemaker. The family moved from New York to Littleton, Colorado in 1993 when his father retired from the Air Force. Harris attended Ken Carroll Middle School where he met Dylan Klebold, although they did not become close friends at first. In 1996, Eric Harris created a private website on America Online, initially to host levels for use in the video game Doom. Harris began blogging about sneaking out of the house to cause mischief and vandalism. In early 1997, the blog postings began to show signs of Harris's anger against society. By the end of the year, the site contained instructions on how to make explosives. Harris's site attracted few visitors and caused no concern until August 1997, after Harris ended a blog post detailing murderous fantasies with, "All I want to do is kill and injure as many of you as I can, especially a few people, like Brooks Brown." Brown was a classmate of Harris's. After Brown's parents viewed the site, they contacted the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. An investigator wrote a draft affidavit to request a search warrant for the Harris household, but it was never submitted to a judge. That October, Harris talked of shooting trick-or-treaters with a BB gun, but never carried it out.
If Eric Harris can be described as a murderous psychopath, completely unable to have empathy for anyone other than himself, Dylan Klebold can be described as an adolescent depressive. He wrote of suicide, loneliness, and to Dylan Klebold, this was as much a suicide mission as it was a murder mission.
Dylan Bennett Klebold was born on September 11, 1981 in Lakewood, Colorado. His parents were pacifists, and even though the family was of partial Jewish heritage, they attended a Lutheran church with their children. On January 30, 1998, Harris and Klebold were arrested for breaking into a white van parked near Littleton and stealing tools and computer equipment. They subsequently pled guilty to felony theft. The judge sentenced them to a juvenile diversion program. They attended mandatory classes such as anger management and were released from diversion several weeks early because of positive actions in the program. Shortly after being released from the diversion program, Harris reverted his website back to Doom. He began to write his thoughts down in a journal. Klebold had already been keeping a personal journal since March 1997. As early as November of that year, Klebold had mentioned going on a killing spree. This contradicts the notion that Harris was the alpha in the duo and that Dylan Klebold was merely following him. Klebold used his journal to vent about his personal problems as well as what he'd wear and use during the attack. In both their journals, Harris and Klebold would later plot the attack. Harris and Klebold both made entries in their journals about sexuality. Klebold expressed shame for his sexual interest, which included bondage and foot fetishism. Harris described his desire for sex with women, especially his desire of raping and torturing women in his bedroom. Although both boys were good students, their schoolwork foreshadowed the massacre. They both displayed violent themes of their creative writing projects. In December 1997, Harris wrote a paper on school shootings titled Guns in School, and a poem from the perspective of a bullet. Klebold wrote a short story about a man killing students. This worried his teacher so much that she alerted his parents. Both also actively researched war and murder. For one project, Harris wrote a paper on Nazi Germany, and Klebold wrote a paper on Charles Manson. In a psychology class, Harris wrote he dreamed of going on a shooting spree with Klebold. Harris's journals describe several experimental bomb detonations. Nearly a year before the massacre, Klebold wrote a message in Harris's 1998 yearbook, making a clear reference to a plan to carry out murder at Columbine. Killing enemies, blowing up stuff, killing cops, not to mention a revenge in the Commons. The Commons was slang for the school cafeteria. On March 6, 1999, the killers held target practice in nearby foothills known as Rampart Range, with the weapons they would use in the massacre. Film footage of the target practice was released in 2003. In the months prior to the attacks, Harris and Klebold acquired 2 9mm firearms and 2 12-gauge shotguns. Harris's shotgun was sawed off to around 26 inches, and Klebold shortened his shotgun's length to 23 inches, a felony under the National Firearms Act. On November 22, 1998, their friend Robin Anderson purchased a carbine rifle and the 2 shotguns for the pair at a gun show, as they were too young to legally purchase the guns themselves. Harris and Klebold were both enrolled in video production classes and kept 5 videotapes. One was called Hitmen for Hire, another was called Rampart Range, and the third was called Radioactive Clothing. Some of the tapes detailed their plans and reasons for the massacre, including the ways they hid their weapons and deceived their parents. Most were shot in the Harris family basement and are thus known as the basement tapes. Harris and Klebold worked part-time at a local Blackjack Pizza. Through Philip Duran, one of their co-workers, Klebold bought a handgun from Mark Maines for $500 at a gun show on January 23rd. Maine's girlfriend, and Duran are all in the Rampart Range video.
What happened? Another strange thing about this case was, this was not a spontaneous last-minute effort on the part of these 2 boys. They had planned this killing for almost a year. The date they chose, what they call Judgment Day, was supposed to be April 19th, 1999. They chose that date in order to correspond to the bombing of the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City just a few years earlier on that same date. But some events beyond their control necessitated a last-minute change, and the date was changed from April 19th to April 20th.
They needed the extra day to procure more ammunition. On April 20th, 30 minutes before the attack, they made a final video saying goodbye and apologizing to their friends and families.
One author of a book about the Columbine Massacre describes it more as a failed bombing than a successful mass shooting. The killers intended to set off propane bombs inside the school, and they had a bomb waiting for first responders, anyone who went away from the school property or was on the way to the school to assist, but those bombs did not detonate. And so a mass shooting began instead.
Harris and Klebold constructed a total of 99 bombs. These included pipe bombs, carbon dioxide cartridges filled with gunpowder or crickets, Molotov cocktails, and propane tanks converted to bombs. The propane bombs were used in the cafeteria, the shooters' cars, and an off-campus location as a diversion. For ignition, they used storm matches, cannon fuses, and model rocket igniters, as well as timing devices built from mechanical alarm clocks for the propane bombs. During the massacre, they carried match strikers taped to their forearms for easy ignition of the pipe bombs and the CO2 bombs. Harris also experimented with napalm and envisioned a kind of backpack flamethrower. They both attempted to get another friend and co-worker, Chris Morris, to keep the napalm at his house, but he refused. Harris also tried to recruit him to be a third shooter, but played it off as a joke when rebuked. Harris's website contained instructions on making pipe bombs and Molotovs, and the extensive use of shrapnel. Harris's father, who was accused of minimizing or covering up some of his son's misdeeds, but probably no more than most other parents might do, once discovered one of his pipe bombs. Harris's journal logged the creation of 25 pipe bombs. Klebold scared his co-workers by once bringing a pipe bomb into work. They would give various nicknames to their pipe bombs. After the massacre, 2 pipe bombs had been left in Klebold's bedroom, one named Vengeance and the other Atlanta, presumably after the 1996 Olympic Park bombing. They had 8 propane tanks, all converted into bombs. The weekend before the shooting, Harris and Klebold bought 2 propane tanks and other supplies from a hardware store. They bought 6 propane tanks on the morning of the attack. Harris was caught on a Texaco gas station security camera at 9:12 a.m. buying a Blue Rhino propane tank. Both cafeteria bombs included a single 20-pound tank, attached pipe bombs, and supporting gasoline canisters alongside. Both car bombs were made from 2 20-pound propane tanks. Pipe bombs and various containers filled with gasoline were spread throughout the vehicles. 8 pipe bombs were placed in Klebold's car, and 1 in Harris's. The pair intended to detonate their propane bombs in the cafeteria at the busiest lunch hour, killing hundreds of students. Bombs set in their cars in the parking lot would also eventually detonate, killing more students as well as any first responders or reporters who came to the school. But the bombs in the cafeteria and cars failed to detonate. On Tuesday morning, April 20th, 1999, Harris and Klebold placed 2 duffel bags in the cafeteria. Each bag contained propane bombs set to detonate during the A lunch shift, which began at 11:15 a.m. Jefferson County Sheriff's Deputy Neil Gardner was assigned to the high school as a full-time school resource officer. Deputy Gardner usually ate lunch with students in the cafeteria, but on April 20th, he was eating lunch in his patrol car at the northwest corner of the campus, watching students in the Smoker's Pit in Clement Park, a meadow adjacent to the school. 2 backpacks filled with pipe bombs, aerosol canisters, and small propane bombs were also placed in a field about 3 miles south of Columbine. The bombs were intended as a diversion to draw firefighters and emergency personnel away from the school. Only the pipe bombs and one of the aerosol canisters detonated, causing a small fire, which was quickly extinguished by the fire department. Bomb technicians immediately examined the bombs and relayed to police at the school the possibility of devices with motion activators. Harris and Klebold changed clothes and returned separately to Columbine High School, parking in different lots. As Harris pulled into the parking lot, he encountered classmate Brooks Brown, the same student he had once threatened, but with whom he had recently patched things up. Brown was surprised to see Harris, who had been absent from a class test. Brown berated Harris for missing the test. Harris replied, "It doesn't matter anymore," and said, "Brooks, I like you now. Get out of here. Go home." Brown left the campus. Harris and Klebold armed themselves using straps and webbing to conceal weapons beneath their trench coats. They lugged bags containing bombs and ammunition. Harris had concealed his shotgun in one of the bags. Beneath the trench coats, Harris wore a military bandolier and a white t-shirt with the inscription "Natural Selection" in black letters, a mantra he had adopted. Klebold wore a black t-shirt with "Wrath" in red letters.
The shootings took place in several areas of school, including the hallways, the cafeteria, where the first bomb was supposed to go off, and where over 400 students were gathered for lunch. And that's why the bomb was put there and set to go off at that time, to kill as many of those students as possible. But that didn't work.
At 11:19 a.m., Rachel Scott and her friend Richard Castaldo were having lunch and sitting on the grass next to the west entrance of the school. Klebold threw a pipe bomb towards the parking lot. The bomb only partially detonated, causing it to give off smoke. Castaldo thought it was a crude senior prank, as did several other students. Sometime later, Harris and Klebold returned to where Rachel Scott and Richard Castaldo lay on the ground injured. Scott was killed instantly when she was hit 4 times with rounds fired by Harris. Castaldo was shot 8 times in the chest, arm, and abdomen, by both Harris and Klebold. He was left paralyzed below the chest. At one point, Klebold's weapon jammed, and he was forced to temporarily cease shooting to fix it, which he did by reloading a new magazine into his pistol. Meanwhile, Harris took off his trench coat and aimed his carbine down a staircase in the direction of 3 students, Daniel Rohrbaugh, Sean Graves, and Lance Kirkland. The students presumed they were paintball guns and were about to walk up the staircase directly below the shooters. Harris fired 10 times, killing Rohrbaugh and injuring Graves and Kirkland. David Sanders, a teacher and coach at the school, was in the cafeteria when he heard the gunfire and began warning students. Harris turned west and fired 7 shots in the direction of 5 students sitting on the grassy hillside adjacent to the steps and opposite the west entrance of the school. Michael Johnson was hit in the face, leg, and arm, but ran and escaped. Mark Taylor was shot in the chest, arms, and leg and fell to the ground, where he faked death. The other 3 escaped uninjured. Klebold fired down the stairs with his shotgun, injuring Nicholas Foss with a graze wound. Then he walked down the steps toward the cafeteria. He came up to Lance Kirkland, who was already wounded and lying on the ground, weakly calling for help. Klebold said, "Sure, I'll help you," then shot Kirkland in the jaw with his shotgun. Miraculously, Kirkland survived. After shooting Kirkland, Klebold walked towards the cafeteria door. He then stepped over the injured Sean Graves to enter the cafeteria. Graves remembered Klebold saying, "Sorry, dude." Klebold briefly entered the cafeteria and did not shoot at the several people still inside. He left the cafeteria and went back up the stairs to join Harris. They each shot at students standing close to a soccer field, but did not hit anyone. They walked toward the west entrance, throwing pipe bombs in several directions, including onto the roof. Only a few of these pipe bombs detonated. Witnesses heard one of them say, "This is what we always wanted to do. This is awesome." Art teacher Patty Nielsen was inside the school. She had noticed the commotion and walked toward the west entrance with student Brian Anderson. Nielsen had intended to walk outside to tell the 2 students to knock it off, thinking they were either filming a video or pulling a student prank. As Anderson opened the first set of double doors, the gunman shot out the windows, injuring him with flying glass. Nielsen was hit in the shoulder with shrapnel. Anderson and Nielsen ran back down the hall into the library, and Nielsen alerted the students inside to the danger, telling them to get under desk and keep silent. She dialed 911 and hid under a counter. At 11:22 a.m., a custodian called Resource Officer Neil Gardner, requesting assistance in the senior parking lot. He heard on his police radio that a female was down and assumed she had been struck by a car. While exiting his patrol car in the senior lot at 11:24, he heard another call on the school radio. "Neil, there's a shooter inside the school." Harris immediately turned and fired 10 shots at Deputy Gardner, who was 60 yards away. As Harris reloaded, Gardner leaned over the top of his patrol car and fired 4 rounds at Harris from his service pistol. Harris ducked behind the building, and Gardner momentarily believed that he had hit him. Harris then re-emerged and fired at least 4 more rounds at Gardner before retreating into the building. Gardner reported on his police radio, "Shots in the building. I need someone in the south lot with me." The shooters then entered the school through the west entrance, moving along the hallway, throwing pipe bombs and shooting at anyone they encountered. Klebold shot Stephanie Munson in the ankle, but she was able to walk out of the school. After proceeding through the hall several times and shooting toward and missing any students they saw, they went toward the west entrance and turned into the library hallway. Deputies Paul Smoker and Paul Mager, motorcycle patrolmen for the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, were writing a traffic ticket north of the school when the female down call came at 11:23 a.m. Taking the shortest route, they drove their motorcycles over grass between the athletic fields and headed toward the west entrance. When they saw deputies Scott Taborski, Rick Searle, and Kevin Walker following them with their patrol car, they abandoned their motorcycles for the safety of the car. These 6 deputies had begun to rescue 2 wounded students near the ball fields, when another gunfight broke out at 11:26 as Harris returned to the double doors and again began shooting at Deputy Gardner, who returned fire. From the hilltop, Deputy Smoker fired 3 rounds from his pistol at Harris, who again retreated into the building. Inside the school cafeteria, Dave Sanders and 2 custodians, John Curtis and Jay Gallatin, initially told students to get under the tables. Then they evacuated students up the staircase leading to the second floor of the school. Sanders then tried to secure as much of the school as he could. Sanders and another student were at the end of the hallway where he gestured for students in the library to stay before encountering Harris and Klebold, who were approaching from the corner of the north hallway. Sanders and the student turned and ran in the opposite direction. Harris and Klebold shot at them both, with Harris hitting Sanders twice in the back and neck, hitting his teeth on exit, but missing the student. Klebold walked over towards Sanders, who had collapsed, and tossed a pipe bomb, then returned to Harris up the library hallway. Sanders struggled toward the science area, and teacher Rich Long took him into a classroom where 30 students were located. A student named Aaron Hansey and others administered first aid to Sanders for 3 hours, but Sanders died from his wounds. Using a phone in the room, Miller and several students maintained contact with police outside the school.
While no area of the school was spared the carnage inflicted by these two killers, some of the worst carnage occurred in the school cafeteria. Some of the worst carnage occurred in the school library. In the library, a teacher and several students were huddled under desks, while the teacher and other students were making 911 phone calls, some of which were recorded. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold entered the library. According to survivors, both boys would alternately look under a desk and say peekaboo. They might shoot, they might not. The shooting was totally random, it seemed. One boy, who was an acquaintance of Dylan Klebold's, said that Klebold looked under the table where he was hiding and said something like, "Hello," and the boy replied, "Dylan, what are you doing?" Klebold calmly responded, "Killing people."
Art teacher Patty Nielsen called 911 from the library, telling her story and urging students to take cover beneath desks. Her call was received by a 911 operator at 11:25 a.m. 4 minutes later, Harris and Klebold entered the library. They shouted, "Get up! All athletes stand up, and today is your day to die." While ordering the jocks to stand up, one of the two said, "Anybody with a white hat or a sports emblem on is dead." Wearing a white baseball cap at Columbine was a tradition among sports team members. When no one stood up, Harris said, "Fine, then I'll just start shooting." This led to the theory that the massacre was an attempt at revenge against athletes. Harris fired his shotgun twice at a desk. Student Evan Todd was hit by wood splinters in the eye and lower back, but was not seriously injured. He then hid behind a counter. The gunman walked into the library towards the 2 rows of computers. Sitting at the north row was disabled student Kyle Velasquez. Klebold fired his shotgun, fatally hitting him in the head and back. Klebold removed his trench coat. He then fired his shotgun at a nearby table, injuring 3 students. Harris walked to the lower row of computer desks with his shotgun and fired a single shot under the first desk while down on one knee. He hit 14-year-old Stephen Kernow with a mortal wound to the neck. He then moved to the adjacent computer desk, injuring 17-year-old Casey Rucksager with a shot which passed through her right shoulder, also grazing her neck and severing a major artery. When she started gasping in pain, Harris said, "Quit your bitching." After fatally shooting Casey Bernal, Harris turned to the next table where Bree Pasquale sat next to the table rather than under it. Harris's nose was bleeding. He had broken it because of a recoil. Harris asked Pasquale if she wanted to die, and she pleaded for her life. Harris laughed and responded, "Everyone's gonna die." When Klebold said, "Shoot her," Harris responded, "No, we're gonna blow up the school anyway." Klebold then walked toward another table, where he discovered one of the few African-American students at Columbine, 18-year-old Isaiah Scholes, along with 16-year-old Matthew Kechter and 16-year-old Craig Scott hiding underneath. Klebold called Scholes the N-word and tried to pull him out from under the table. They taunted Scholes for a few seconds, making derogatory racial comments. The gunmen both fired under the table. Harris shot Scholes once in the chest, killing him, and Klebold shot and killed Kechter. Though Scholes was not shot in the head, Klebold said, "I didn't know black brains could fly that far." Harris then yelled, "Who's ready to die next?" While still in the library, Klebold shot 17-year-old Mark Kington in the head and shoulder. He then injured 18-year-olds Lisa Kreutz, Lauren Townsend, and Valine Schnurr with the same shotgun blast. Klebold then moved toward the same table and fired several shots, killing Lauren Townsend. At this point, Valine Schnurr began screaming, "Oh my God!" Klebold asked Schnurr if she believed in the existence of God. When Schnurr replied that she did, Klebold asked why, and commented, "God is gay." Klebold reloaded but walked away from the table. Harris approached another table where two girls were hiding. He bent down to look at them and dismissed them as pathetic. Harris then moved to another table where he fired twice, injuring 16-year-olds Nicole Nolan and John Tomlin. Tomlin moved out from under the table. Klebold shot him repeatedly, killing him. Harris then walked over to the other side of the table where Townsend lay dead. Behind the table, a 16-year-old girl named Kelly Fleming had, like Bree Pascal, sat next to the table rather than beneath it due to lack of space. Harris shot Fleming with his shotgun, hitting her in the back and killing her. He shot at the table behind Fleming, hitting Lauren Townsend, who was already dead, and wounding 18-year-old Gianna Park. Harris shot 15-year-old Daniel Mauser in the hand. Mauser retaliated by either shoving a chair at Harris or grabbing at his leg. Harris fired again and hit Mauser in the center of the face at close range, killing him. Harris then fired 3 shots at another table, critically injuring two 17-year-olds, Jennifer Doyle and Austin Eubanks. Klebold then shot once, fatally wounding 17-year-old Corey DePuter at 11:35. They had killed 10 people in the library and wounded 12. Harris and Klebold walked out of the library at 11:36. 10 injured and 29 uninjured survivors began to evacuate the library through an emergency exit door.
These two boys were clearly enjoying themselves. According to survivors, after they would shoot at someone, sometimes they would whoop, holler, whistle, you name it. They were having a good time. The killing started around 11:19 a.m., while many Columbine students were in the cafeteria having lunch. It went on for almost 50 minutes. By this time, paramedics, law enforcement had arrived, and a gun battle had ensued. Once Harris and Klebold realized that their mission, if you will, was over, they went to the school cafeteria and turned the guns on themselves, and both boys died at the scene.
After leaving the library, Harris and Klebold entered the science area, where they caused a fire in an empty storage closet. It was extinguished by a teacher who had hidden in an adjacent room. At 11:44 a.m., they re-entered the cafeteria. Harris crouched against the rail on the staircase and fired toward the propane bombs left in the cafeteria in an unsuccessful attempt to detonate them. Klebold lit a Molotov cocktail and threw it at a propane bomb. About a minute later, the gallon of fuel attached to the bomb ignited, causing a fire that was extinguished by the fire sprinklers a few minutes later. They left the cafeteria at 11:46. They returned to the main hallways and fired several shots into walls and ceilings as students and teachers hid in rooms. They walked into the main office before returning to the hallway. At 11:56, they returned to the cafeteria and briefly entered the school kitchen. They returned up the staircase and into the south hallway at 12 p.m. They re-entered the library, which was empty of survivors except for an unconscious Patrick Ireland and another injured student. Once inside, at 12:02 p.m., Harris and Klebold shot at police again through the library windows. By 12:05, all gunfire from the school had ceased. Sometime within the next 3 minutes, Harris sat down with his back to a bookshelf and fired his shotgun through the roof of his mouth. Klebold went down on his knees and shot himself in the left temple. By 12:08 p.m., both gunmen had killed themselves. In 2002, the National Enquirer published 2 post-mortem photos of Harris and Klebold in the library. Patrick Ireland had regained and lost consciousness several times after being shot by Klebold. Paralyzed on his right side, he crawled to the library windows where, on live television at 2:38 p.m., he stretched out the window, intending to fall into the arms of 2 SWAT team members standing on the roof of an emergency vehicle. But instead, he fell directly onto the vehicle's roof in a pool of blood. Patrick Ireland became known as the boy in the window. The team members were later criticized for allowing Ireland to drop more than 7 feet to the ground while doing nothing to ensure he could be lowered to the ground safely or break his fall.
Well, the Columbine case caused school officials across the country to re-examine their security policies. A big question on the minds of the media, the American public, and the entire world for that matter, was what was the cause?
Following the Columbine shooting, schools across the United States instituted new security measures, such as see-through backpacks, metal detectors, school uniforms, and security guards. Schools also adopted a zero-tolerance approach to possession of weapons and threatening behavior by students. Some believe the zero-tolerance approach adopted in schools has been implemented too harshly, with unintended consequences creating other problems. But contrary to popular perception, school shootings are rare compared to other types of shootings, and school shootings are not on the rise. Although the discussion is complicated over coming to a consensus as to what constitutes a school shooting or a mass shooting. As is the case with many kinds of crime, the public often perceives an increase in any behavior based on how much the news media chooses to report it.
The news media, as it often does, jump to premature conclusions that would give them a good story and perhaps put some closure or some explanation as to why this occurred. Unfortunately, almost all the earlier explanations about why this occurred, what the boys' motives were wrong or overly simplistic. One of the first explanations as to why this happened was that Harris and Klebold enjoyed wearing trench coats. A number of students at Columbine, other places too, had started wearing trench coats, sort of a fad, if you will, and Dylan Klebold supposedly enjoyed making people uneasy in public by wearing a trench coat, particularly when it was warm weather. But that does not explain why this happened. The trench coat mafia, if you will, did exist at Columbine, but one of the survivors of this event said he was part of the trench coat mafia and that Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold were not part of their group. Their main preoccupation, besides wearing trench coats, was simply playing video games. So the trench coat mafia idea, although this event spawned many imitators, does not explain this massacre. Another possible explanation: the two boys were outcast and loners, had no friends. Not true. While Eric Harris in particular had done much to alienate people around him in the past several months or years leading up to the shooting, both boys had friends besides each other. In fact, Dylan Klebold had attended senior prom only a few nights before this event occurred. So the idea these boys were outcasts and seeking revenge against the in-group does not hold up. Was this attack based on race? The vast majority of students at Columbine High School were white, like Harris and Klebold. There were a few ethnic minorities, including Hispanics, Native Americans, and African Americans. One of the victims here was Hispanic. Another victim was African American. But some African American students and some Hispanic students, again, were intentionally spared by the killers. The race angle was played up, though, by the fact that in the library, one of the boys hiding under the table was an African American student named Isaiah. When Harris saw this young man under the table, he called Dylan Klebold over and said, "Look, we have an N-word here," and they shot him. But again, race does not explain this attack. Was religion a factor in this attack? Some people noted that among the victims were outspoken born-again Christians. That also does not hold up. Although Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, particularly Eric Harris, made derogatory comments about Christians in some of his videos and recordings, this clearly was not an attack based solely on religion. So the religious angle does not hold up either. In fact, Dylan Klebold was Jewish, although not particularly observant. Eric Harris did not know this. He had made many derogatory comments about Jews. They did not know that Dylan Klebold was Jewish until they were carrying this massacre out. Was this massacre a revenge event for bullying? Well, while the two boys were bullied to some extent, there was no question also that they bullied others. And while bullying is never anything to be laughed at, it probably was not any more of a factor here at Columbine than it is at most schools in the United States. In fact, one of the placards on these walls reads, "Columbine is no different than any other high school." So the bullying explanation does not explain very much either.
Unfortunately, the word Columbine has become synonymous with school shootings, and the incident has fueled copycats. Perhaps more sickening is that school shooters have become pop culture icons. Songs like "Pumped Up Kicks" by the pop group Foster the People, upbeat song about a disturbed teenage boy who entertains fantasies of killing wealthy students because they can afford expensive tennis shoes, have fueled this perverse idea. After the attack, Robin Anderson, who had purchased some of the weapons used in the attack, told investigators that she believed the pair wanted the weapons for target shooting and denied prior knowledge of their plans. Anderson was not charged. But Mark Maines and Philip Duran were prosecuted. Each was charged with supplying a handgun to a minor and possession of a sawed-off shotgun. Maines was sentenced to 6 years in prison. Duran was given 4.5 years in prison. After the massacre, many survivors and relatives of deceased victims filed lawsuits. Most cases against the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office and the school district were dismissed on the grounds of government immunity. The case against the Sheriff's Office regarding the death of Dave Sanders was not dismissed. due to the police preventing paramedics from going to his aid for hours after they knew the gunmen were dead. The case was settled out of court. In April 2001, the families of more than 30 victims received a $2.5 million settlement in their case against the families of Harris, Klebold, Maines, and Duran. The Harris family kept a low profile after the shooting, and so did the family of Dylan Klebold, at least at first. Sue Klebold initially believed that Dylan was merely being led along by Eric Harris, but later came around to admitting that her son was equally culpable. She and her husband Thomas eventually divorced. Sue Klebold eventually entered the public eye, writing A Mother's Reckoning and making public and media appearances discussing the signs that she missed and raising awareness of mental illness, depression, and suicide among adolescents.
Well, it's unfortunate that most people, including me, better remember the names of the killers than they do the victims. That's why this memorial is here. The victims' names are imprinted on these walls you see behind me.
The names of the victims are Rachel Scott, age 17, Daniel Rohrbaugh, age 15, David Sanders, age 47, the only teacher killed in the massacre, Kyle Velasquez, age 16, Stephen Kernow, age 14, Cassie Bernal, age 17, Isaiah Scholes, age 18, Matthew Kechter, age 16, Lauren Townsend, age 18, John Tomlin, age 16, Kelly Fleming, age 16, Daniel Mauser, age 15, and Corey DePuter, age 17. Then there were the secondary victims. 17-year-old Anne-Marie Hochhalter was partially paralyzed in the massacre. Her mother committed suicide 6 months later. Anne-Marie Hochhalter died on February 19, 2025, at the age of 43. Her death was caused by sepsis, secondary to her paraplegia, and the manner of death deemed a homicide. Greg Barnes, a 17-year-old student who had witnessed Dave Sanders' shooting, died by suicide in May 2000. Austin Eubanks, who was injured during the shooting, became heavily medicated, developing an opioid addiction. He eventually overcame and later spoke publicly about the addiction, but died from an accidental overdose in 2019 at the age of 37.
Some of the signage here at the memorial. This wall of healing is dedicated to those who were injured at Columbine High School and to all who were touched by the tragic events of April 20th, 1999. Some of the recollections from the survivors. I hope people come here to this place to think about how they themselves can be better people rather than come here to reflect on death. I used to fight all the time with my sister. I used to pick on her a lot. I don't do that anymore. The teachers were so amazing. They had such inner strength. They set good examples of how we could all get through it. He was a 4.0 student before he was shot and paralyzed, and he remained a 4.0 student after. But remember, this was a kid who had to relearn to read and write before he could graduate. And perhaps this student captures it well. I would be misleading you if I said I understand this. I don't. Well, I hope you enjoyed this edition of Crime Chronicles. As we delve into the darker side of human nature, we invite you to join us on our journey by liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Your support helps make possible our inquiry into the sometimes unsettling but always fascinating phenomenon known as crime and justice. So hit that like and subscribe button right now and don't miss future episodes. Till then, Mark Jones, hoping you will join our Crime Chronicles community. And thanks for tuning in.